Hey media nerds, in this video I'm going to take you through the feedback I gave my students on the 2020 Narrative and Ideology school assessed coursework. I've put a link to that task in the notes. Feel free to take a look at it. It's good for SAC revision, exam revision, and in this video I'm going to take you through how to approach the questions and also show you some examples of responses that students wrote that were really, really good. So let's take a look at the narrative SAC that I've just returned to my students. Now this particular SAC, you'll notice, is out of 20 marks, and for anyone who's taken a look at the VCE Media Study Design, you'll realise this outcome is assessed out of 40 marks. So why is that the case? Well, basically I split the assessment for this task up into two parts. So 20 marks on the first SAC that I get students to sit, which is on Get Out, and 20 marks on the second SAC, which is on Aliens. Feel free to take this task and use it for practice and exam revision, but I wouldn't go using it for an actual assessment task or any of the questions because it's definitely out there in the public domain now. So let's take a look at the first question, and the first question I put onto the SAC was identify the institutional context of one of the narratives that you studied. It's really important in terms of narrative and ideology that you can identify, I guess, the institution that made your narratives. So it could be the film studio or something like that. And then in the second part of the question, I asked students to discuss how the institutional context shaped the narrative. In the case of Get Out, it was produced by Blumhouse Pictures. A couple of observations about how students responded to this question. You don't know the institution that created the narrative that you're studying. Make sure you find out for the exam. And then be able to discuss the institutional context and how that shaped the narrative. Now, in the second part here, some students were very good at telling me about about Blumhouse Pictures and their production ethos. If you don't know, they make quite low budget films for between $1 and $5 million, which are guaranteed to make their money back. About 40% of Blumhouse Pictures go nowhere and end up going straight to Netflix or straight to DVD. But every so often, there are films that are wildly successful. Films like The Purge, Paranormal Activity, Split, and Get Out that take, about $200 million. And I really look forward to new Blumhouse films. They're kind of banking on the fact that some of their films are going to be complete flops. When it came to this question, I found some students were really good at describing the institutional context, but then didn't take the next step to explaining how that shaped the narrative. And I think the lesson from this is that in assessment tasks like this and in the exam, it's really important to read the question carefully. The other thing I noted here as well is it's very important to be very concise, and some people wrote a little bit too much for this question. I think the way the VCE media exam is at the moment, students who can express ideas very concisely are rewarded, and that's a skill that you've got to practice. So what I'm going to show you is some little excerpts from some of these answers. So not the entire answers, because this is not about copying someone else's work. This is about really looking at the qualities of a good response. And what I liked about this little piece of writing is the way it links the institutional context of the film to the narrative. And it does it in a really concise way that's appropriate to a 2-mark question. In the Independent Film Forum, Peele revealed that there was a good chance it would never get made, given that the narrative is resolved when a black man brutally kills a white family. The low-budget ethos of Blumhouse enabled Peele to take risks that would have been difficult with a bigger studio. So making that link between the production company and the narrative in really quite a concise way. The next question, explain how the opening of a narrative that you studied used a code or convention to engage the audience. Now, when you're reading questions like this, it is really important to focus in on what you're being asked about and don't give, I guess, more detail or irrelevant detail to the question that's been posed. So this question is asking about a code or a convention, and the response really needs to focus on one of those things. And of course, in any scene in a film, it's going to be, the story is going to be told and the audience is going to be engaged through a combination of these things. So you kind of need to tailor your response or that scene that you're writing about to really focus on that one thing. And I thought I was being really kind here by posing a question that asked students to focus on one code or one convention. Unfortunately, a few people included a bit too much kind of irrelevant detail, so focusing on other codes and conventions apart from the one that they had identified. When approaching a question like this, I guess it's important to really find the best example, the example in the most detail. And I've got to say, the students who do really well on these tasks are the ones who can replay those scenes in their heads and know them in very specific detail. And of course, we are writing about audience engagement here. So you've got to pick a scene that really makes the audience feel something. And audience engagement could be something that you're asked about on the exam. So make sure you know a few scenes that really do make the audience feel something. In terms of structure, as I've mentioned, some students wanted to bring in reference to additional codes and conventions, which you can, of course, do fleetingly because stories are told through a combination of these things. But you really do have to focus on that one code or that one convention that you've identified in your topic sentence. So don't go including too much detail about other codes or conventions or any other irrelevant details. And in these sort of responses, it is very important to be specific and descriptive. So you identify a particular scene and you describe how this code or convention is engaging the audience, through a particular shot or through a particular sound. So let's take a look at a student who did this quite successfully. And this is just a short excerpt from her quite detailed response about the opening scene of Get Out. And what this student is focusing on here is the use of sound. And what I love about this response is the way that she's being very specific, writing about particular sounds, particular lines of dialogue, and explaining how they make the audience feel. And she starts this response by describing how Dre is explaining his concern about being in a creepy, confusing-ass suburb. This dialogue is humorous for the audience, endearing them to the character, but also hints at the fear of a black man walking through a white suburban neighborhood. Moments later, a white car pulls up next to him, its brakes squealing ominously. The 1939 song Run Rabbit Run plays from the car's speakers, suggesting to the audience that Dre is in danger and should run. What I love about this, very specific about three moments of sound within that scene and explaining how they help to engage the audience. And that's really what you've got to do here. Now, question 3 asks students to discuss how a media code and a media convention combined to convey meaning in one of the narratives studied. And I always phrase questions in this way because this is the way those questions will be phrased on the exam. So even in the SAC that is focusing on Get Out, you're going to see I phrase the questions quite broadly. Now, when it comes to question 3, I guess once again, you've got to choose the best example. Choose a scene where there is a very clear convention that's combining with a code to tell the audience something, to convey an aspect of story. So a really good example of this is perhaps character. Lots of scenes in terms of character development will incorporate the use of camera, acting, mise-en-scène, editing, lighting, or sound. So character's always a good one to go for. In terms of the different responses I saw here, some students chose to write about the character establishment of Chris at the beginning of the film through the use of camera and his relationship with Rose. Some people chose to write about how point of view combines with acting to convey the trauma of Chris's childhood during the hypnotism scene. And the one that we're about to look at is how multiple storylines combine with acting to develop the mystery surrounding Walter and Georgina in this film. So you've really got to read the question carefully, and this scene is asking for a single code and a single convention. And that little acronym there, RTFQ, stands for Read the Bloody Question. And it's so important when it comes to tasks like this. And the students who did well clearly identified the code and convention in that first sentence and then went on to be specific and descriptive, referring to a particular scene and then, describing particular moments in that scene. So in this particular example, the student did a really good job of identifying that code and that convention in the very first sentence, the very first line, in fact. Multiple storylines combined with acting to convey the mystery of Walter and Georgina in Get Out. So she's going to be focusing on acting in this response. And as you look at the response, this student does a really good job of that, of being very specific about elements of the performance. And this is what she's written when she's described Walter's acting. Walter's smile doesn't falter as he speaks in a strangely formal tone, joking that Rose is a real doggone keeper, tilting his head down slightly and chuckling. As Walter laughs, his whole body convulses stiffly, further emphasizing his somewhat robotic body language. So very specific about what the actor is doing, about what the actor's saying. So this is very specific about what the actor is doing, how the actor is delivering particular lines, and I find acting very difficult to write about, and this is a fantastic response. Now, question 4 is one that you will probably definitely see on the exam in some guys. It's about ideology. This outcome is called narrative and ideology, and it's inviting students to write about those two things. And the question is, discuss how the ideological context of one narrative you studied shaped its construction. Now, the students who did well on this particular question were very clear and informed in their understanding of the ideological context, the things that people believed in the society when this film was made. Students who do this well, can quote the director, can refer to opinion surveys, might refer to events in society, or even other films and other narratives that were made during this time. And that's really the first part of the question. The next part of the question really invites a specific and descriptive discussion of that narrative. So the students who really succeeded here were able to dive into a particular scene and describe how ideology had shaped that. Now, along the way, of course, students do need to be using appropriate media terminology, so those specific reference to codes and conventions and all of those sorts of things. Now, in this particular example, the student did a great job of setting up the response very concisely. Jordan Peele's Get Out rejects post-racial ideology that developed after the election of Barack Obama in 2009. And what I really like about this response as well is that it draws on particular facts. And I really like this bit towards the beginning. As the conservative radio host Lou Dobbs mentioned, many people believed that America had become a post-racial, post-partisan society. Being able to quote someone or refer to a statistic or make reference to a historical event that's appropriate can really help to substantiate your discussion and make it more authoritative. And what I really loved about this response is the fact that the student has been very specific in their discussion of scenes and how they've been shaped by the rejection of this ideology. Gordon shakes Chris's hand and says, "That's quite a grip." He then proceeds to talk about how he knew Tiger and he was the best I've ever seen. Turning the conversation towards race illustrates how African Americans suffer harmful microaggressions. Peele cuts to a reaction shot of Chris and Rose, who cocks her head and sarcastically says, "That's great." So that detail is very nice there. So I hope you have a go at this task. Maybe you can share it with your friends, reflect on your performance, do a bit of peer assessment and that sort of thing to help to prepare you for the SAC that you'll do in class, but maybe also the end of your exam.